this talk in many ways is a more focused version of the earlier one where I spoke about industries in general, manufacturing in general. This one is specifically on the railroad and its connection to freedom and slavery in the antebellum period, both North and South, although most of what I'll say is specific to the South. So it'll include a little bit more statistics and numerical data, which hopefully will continue to dispel the myth of Southern backwardness. I also think it will help us understand a little bit, kind of tying into the previous talk and our ending questions there, a little bit on the lost cause idea. And now I wouldn't say how it got started per se, but fuel for its further evolution. Hopefully I'll talk about, or I'll illuminate ways the railroad drove economic progress through the antebellum period, and tie that to some racial views in both sections. And finally, I think that the railroad is a great example, a great thing to look at because, and I'm not an economist, so I won't make any kind of claims about it being the best indicator of economic growth or anything like that. But I think it's a very good one because it requires other industries to be strong, like coal and iron. If you don't have those things, you will not have a successful railroad. At the same time, it helps those previously mentioned industries and other industries become stronger. And the vast scale of the railroad requires new forms of thinking and resituates people's experiences in the world. And there are a lot of commonalities. We've talked about differences. There's a lot of commonalities. Both North and South had mixed feelings about the railroad. Some were really excited. Some dreaded it. Some saw it as a great engine of progress. Others believed it would lead to immiseration and ruin. Some saw it as something that could free various creative energies. Others saw it as nothing more than a scam of giant corporations to take over the government and crush people's lives. And that's both sections. And those are feelings that are sort of, I don't want to say necessarily evenly distributed, but those are feelings that you find in every section of every state. Coastal, inland, lowland, upland, however the divisions lay. As I briefly mentioned about its connection to other industries, I think it's really the first widespread heavy industry in terms of its, and by widespread I don't mean many of them because there were hundreds of textile, coal mines, and other things that are could be especially mines and iron work could be considered heavy industry. But this is physically widespread. I mean, the B&O, which will be the longest railroad in the world at the time of the war, was over 300 miles. We don't see that sort of stretch of coal mining or ironworks and those sorts of things. So there's a geographical expanse to it. States that grew no cotton but used a lot of cotton had railroads. States that grew cotton but didn't necessarily have a big milling industry used railroads. There was no sort of division whatsoever in between the primary economic basis or industrial basis of a state and its relation to the railroad, its having a railroad. And before I proceed, just for the record, I'm not going to talk about horse-drawn railroads, smaller trams, inclines, and those sorts of things, all of which preceded the steam-driven locomotive by sometimes decades. I'm really just going to start around the 1830s when we start to see a boom. Dawn mentioned many times the best friend of Charleston, and then there was the Tom Thumb on the B&O. And as we'll see, there is a unified move towards the railroad. But briefly, some statistics. So in 1840, there's less than 3,000 miles of track throughout the entire U.S. By 1860, there's over 10,000. Total receipts are going to grow from 7 million to over 100 million in that whole period. Now, about 2/3 of that throughout the antebellum era are going to be in the North. And you see about the same split of revenues, 2/3 share in the North and in 1840 and in 1860. However, we start to see a shift in, by North, I mean basically those, and I don't mean to be anachronistic like Dr. Wilson was talking about, but by North, I'm speaking generally about those states which would be in the Union, and by South, I'm generally talking about those states which would be in the Confederacy. But we do see a shift in terms of growth in that after 1850 or so, most of the growth in the North is coming from, and we've had this, I guess this is a running gag now, what is the Midwest? Most of those growth is in the Midwest, Indiana, Illinois. For example, Indiana and Illinois have about 3,000, or excuse me, Ohio and Illinois have about 3,000 miles of track by the time of the war. Indiana had just over 2,000. That rivals New York and Pennsylvania and easily outdistances Massachusetts. So we see states that in 1840 had very little explode rapidly, and that's going to be the case in the South too. But between 1840 and 1860, all southern states are at least going to double their mileage. Tennessee, Georgia, and Virginia each have over 1,000. And, you know, I think, I'll come back to this, but I think as an aside, the railroad is a really good example because we've talked a lot about negative things and animosities. The railroad is a really good example of some effort to cooperate sectionally before the war. An idea that because we've talked about the founders' union, or the founders' country, and there was this idea of an equality between states and an equality between the sections. And the railroad is a good example of that. And I'm not a mathematician, but you know, we think of equality in mathematical terms. 1 and 1 is 2, and that's equality. So some of these numbers are unequal mathematically, but there's a spirit of cooperation. Southern engineers are going north. Northern engineers are going south. Both sections are trying to get the British to come. So there's a lot of an exchange that I think should help us think about ways in which, one, before the war there was cooperation, and two, what kind of spirit that really destroyed. Now again, part of the confusion about, and I touched on this in my last lecture, part of the confusion I think about railroads in the South comes from people at the time, and part of it is not necessarily them taking it out of context, but us misunderstanding them. For example, Albert Pike, who was originally from Massachusetts but came to Arkansas and was a newspaper editor, wrote that he believed that his state was behind in industrial development. Now, a lot of people will quote that as evidence that the South was behind. Well, in 1860, Arkansas only had 38 miles of railroad. Now, I'm from central Appalachia. Arkansas is often part of the Ozarks, or is part of the Ozarks, called the Other Appalachia. Before I got down there, I didn't realize Arkansas is really big. It looks small on a map because of its geographical proximity to Texas and Oklahoma, which are even bigger. But Arkansas is bigger than Pennsylvania. And so if you were living in a state that size and you had just 38 miles of track, and there were other states that had over 1,000, you too might think your state was underdeveloped. But that doesn't necessarily mean the whole region is the same way. We should be careful about drawing those generalizations off of the things that were never meant to be general statements. He wasn't making a statement about the South, just Arkansas in particular. And even the smaller states, because neighboring Tennessee, for example, had 1,200 miles. So that's a little bit more than Arkansas has. And the same goes for Western Virginia, too, in terms of, and I mentioned them in the last lecture, until the B&O comes through, and that's just across what at the time was the northwestern tier of Virginia. They don't have a railroad either. And there's a lot of anger, confusion, a lot of discussion about why that is. And I kind of alluded to this, but a lot of it's because a lot of people were still interested in building regular roads and canals. It wasn't some sort of slave conspiracy to keep railroads out of the region. It was some belief that there's other means of transportation. Now, by comparison, and somebody last night talked about this. It might have been Dawn, or not last night, but the night before. The United States by far and away has more railroad mileage than any other country. The South has more railroad mileage than any other country. They have more than Germany, or they have about the same amount as Germany and France combined in 1840. And by 1860, their mileage exceeds the individual totals of any country in Europe. And, that was, that's something that's almost always overlooked. And if the South was backwards, I don't know what the opposite, well, technically the opposite of backwards is forwards, but I don't know what is beyond backwards in terms of development. So if the South is backwards, the Europe must be well behind. And I'm not sure what exactly that word is. Mexico it has problems getting anything accomplished on the railroad before 1860. Canada, which of course is still part of the British Empire at the time, they had some early success, but their government, their system of government guaranteed bonds completely destroyed their progress. And I won't say anything more about that, but it gives us a little bit of an idea of maybe some of what people might have feared was going to happen in terms of the relationship between the two. The last time I ended in Charleston, I'll start in Charleston here, as Dawn has already talked about with the South Carolina Railroad. An excellent example of how everybody in the country is moving or trying to move forward with railroads at the same time. So we have that South Carolina Railroad from Charleston to Hamburg, which is right across the river from Augusta, Georgia. Like he said, it was the longest rail in the country, over 160 miles at the time. Cotton will make up the bulk of its freight, and that's one thing that even those who will admit to railroad presence in the South are like, well, it was just basically a glorified extension of the plantation system because it just hauled cotton, which is not true. All the railroads in the South, if you look at their freight list, anything that you could conceive of being shipped in bulk is shipped on the railroads. I could give you a list, but I think your imagination would be better because my list would just be limited. But just think of anything that can be moved or needs to be moved in vast quantities, and it's on the railroad. Some states did have larger revenues from cotton. The B&O, which I'll talk more about later, it had a huge revenue stream from coal because of the western mines. So it really just depended on the place that the railroad was in and that particular situation. And we see a twofold increase of sales on that South Carolina Railroad over its first decade of operation. And going the other way, what they call up freight from Charleston on is significantly improved and increased as well. And it's not just, Dawn mentioned the passenger service. It's not just the passenger service. It's not just the large goods from plantations and things like that. All along the railroad, towns, inns, dry goods stores, all of these things spring up So we have this economic expansion happening, which of course means goods are going to have to go from, somewhere on the middle of the line or the last 3/4 or the first third or whatever. So new markets are opening up constantly. And I think we need to think about that as well. And I think that if there's any of you who are economic or business historians or interested in that, I think this is something to consider. Because especially in like a small state like Massachusetts or even a larger state, New York, we look at these numbers and it's almost like, the South wasn't doing enough because they didn't have as many or as much track or whatever. And I don't think we should look at it as like a build mentality. Like the two largest railroad systems after the war are going to be the Pennsylvania system, and by large I mean most powerful, and the New York Central. Before the war, especially New York, there basically was a hodgepodge of short and competing systems crisscrossing the Erie Canal route. It was, I don't want to say it was completely disorganized, but it wasn't there was no good methodologically sustained effort to get a railroad from New York City across to the Great Lakes. On the other hand, if you look at Southern railroads, there certainly was competition and no small amount of confusion, but there seems to be a much more concerted effort to do things within a context that will actually better serve the South or better serve that state or even that section, as opposed to just saying, well, we have more than the next guy. They might be roads to nowhere, but they increase our stats. By 1860, even South Carolina had over 900 miles. Again, that's not a whole lot, considering the leading states had close to 3,000, but considering its size, and I'm not very good at geography, but from what I was able to gather, it was around 20th at the time. 930 miles is a pretty good amount. And if you look at, which we'll talk about, if you look at the development of those a little bit more, going over to Augusta, then there's going to be an offshoot into Columbia, and then there's going to be a rail going up to Wilmington. So these places that are important are being linked in a deliberate and strategic way, as opposed to. And to be fair, Pennsylvania did try to do that, but as opposed to some of these other states that are sort of going all over the place. And that line in South Carolina is going to, it was the first, but everybody realized we're going to have these things. So Savannah, once that South Carolina opens up, they realize they got to get in gear because they're going to be left behind if they don't do something. So by 1840, there's a railroad from Savannah to Athens, which is eventually going to go on to Atlanta. There's two railroads. One that is going from Augusta inland to Atlanta, although there won't be a bridge over the river connecting them until the 1850s, but they get that connection to the river by 1840. And then there's that other line, the Central Railroad, coming from Savannah inland, and eventually, that's going to be more spread out as well, because South Carolina is going to Georgia, or South Carolina is going to North Carolina. Wilmington doesn't want to be left behind. They'll lay track from Wilmington to Weldon, North Carolina, which is a town closer to the Virginia line. That's the Wilmington and Raleigh, and that actually overtook the South Carolina Railroad for a while as the new longest railroad in the world. That's going to link up with a railroad from Portsmouth, the Portsmouth and the Petersburg Railroad, which is going to Petersburg in the northern direction, to Virginia, and that's going to connect Richmond, Fredericksburg, and go on to points further north. So we see this network forming pretty quickly. And they also see the merits of going west. That's a pretty strong coastal line there, but all of these places realize we've got to get to the west, or maybe I should phrase that better. We have to go west, go in a westward direction, in order for anything to really happen. So that's why, we go to Atlanta, and then beyond that, link up to Chattanooga, and then Knoxville, and then that heads back over a little bit east to Bristol. And at one point, you could ride from, they're all different lines, but they ended up being connected from Washington, D.C., all the way down into the Mississippi Valley along these various railroads. And from there, there's a number of railroads that are going to head across the Mississippi down into the Delta region, New Orleans. It's a pretty extensive hub. Hopefully you can get the idea of how much the railroad is expanding, how quickly it's expanding, and also how important Southerners see it that it expands. And it brings results. And I'm not a population expert, but in all of the major southern cities that the railroad comes to, population explodes considerably over that time. Charleston is actually the aberration. Their population before the war goes up and down, back and forth. But Baltimore's more than doubles. Richmond's population doubles. Augusta's population doubles. And of course, Atlanta, which is a railroad town, they come from basically nothing to being a major southern city, all within the span of 20, and then, of course, in the case of Atlanta, about 10 years. The railroad is almost kind of a guarantee, or a hope of a guarantee, of some sort of commerce, progress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And even if they followed, which some of them did, sort of this field of dreams approach, if you build it, they will come, they have to have some sort of close to reasonable expectation that they are going to be able to create a steady profit stream off of this enterprise. And a lot of them fail, right? There's a lot of railroads, they form on paper, they have this great plan, they're all excited, and then nothing happens. A lot of them get out there, they survey a route, they start to do a little bit of digging on it, and it fails. So there's certainly a lot of failure, but at the same time, it's definitely an industry that absolutely requires, some legitimate forethought and effort into doing that, which should make us realize the extent to which Southerners understood the need to be entrepreneurial in their efforts to make these lines. And also, of course, something which they realized they had to have if they were going to stay relevant. Every state, every section, that was one of Western Virginia's main complaints against the East, was that they were being consigned to irrelevancy. And even after the war, if you look at a railroad map, all these tracks to the south and all these tracks to the north, and there's like a dead zone in what became West Virginia. So in some extent, they were right about that. But everybody else agreed that that was what had to be done to enable a region to be successful. As I mentioned earlier about the need for plentiful resources, I think we see that best with, like I said, the B&O. The B&O reaches Cumberland, Maryland, in 1843, giving them access to the big vein of the Pennsylvania seam there in western Maryland. As I said before, about half of their tonnage and revenue comes from coal. About a third of the coal that comes out of western Maryland stays in Baltimore. The rest of it goes out to various other ports and centers of industry. So again, that industry is dependent upon, that industry being coal, is dependent upon the railroad for its success. And we see mining output exploding after the B&O gets there. Now, a lot of mines built their own smaller tracks, like the mines in western Maryland built them from Frostburg, which is kind of like in the middle of western Maryland between Pennsylvania and Virginia. But they didn't have the capital to build them all the way to major cities and ports especially. So when the B&O comes through, mining output doubles and in some case even triples. It's not necessarily the amount of coal in the ground didn't overnight increase. And it usually wasn't even because of the technological increases in the mining industry. It was simply we now are in a better position to sell more coal. It doesn't make sense for us to drag it out of the ground and basically move it from one pile to the next. If we can't move it and we can't sell it, we're not gonna mine it. As salt mining declines, coal mining is actually increasing in western Virginia, precisely because of that. Timber is also going to benefit. That's not something I really talked about the last time. The timber industry explodes because of the railroad. They need to clear land to get, obviously, the right-of-way. A lot of early tracks were actually wood with iron over them. So there was that. Bridges, there's all sorts of things the railroad needs to function. And a lot of the earlier railroads, especially in the deeper South, ran first on wood, not on coal. So there's that as well. About 7,000 mills in the South by 1840 are producing $225 million in lumber products. That number had jumped to over 17 million with 4,000 mills and 17,000 mill workers. A lot of that was used within the region, but there was also a considerable export business as well. Before, I want to say a few more things, and then I want to leave more time for questions than we had the last time. I think the best example of Southern enthusiasm for railroads is in the Transcontinental. And the we are most familiar probably with the Transcontinental as a government funded and sanctioned, and depending on who's involved, manipulated enterprise right before, during, and after the war. But there were a lot of independent railroad operators that had dreams for a transcontinental. Texas was, because see, we see the transcontinental as like one single line or maybe two lines melded together. There was a lot of people that had visions of seaming together dozens of different lines to make a transcontinental. Texas believed that they were the state to make the transcontinental happen because there were already rail lines going to New Orleans. All they had to do was make one right across their state, and they would be in a perfect position to head across what are now Mexico and Arizona through to Southern California. There was a huge move in the 1850s in Texas for a transcontinental. Some say it was a bad idea, but they gave away a considerable amount of land and leeway to any company that would be willing to build a transcontinental. It was like 20 acres per 20-acre parcel on either mile, on either side for every 1 mile of track. So they gave a considerable amount. All you had to do was put down $300,000 deposit to secure that bid. A company originally chartered in New York did that. Phil talked a lot about the corruption. I think it was Phil about the corruption after the war. There was definitely corruption. Anytime you're getting government involved, you're sort of opening that door. There were a lot of people that weren't really thrilled about giving away that much land, and especially the $300,000 was supposed to help the government itself. At least half of that wasn't actual money; it was company stock. So what's the stock worth if they don't have a line? I mean, it's just a paper company. So, but anyway, that's how enthusiastic they were about it. And when the war started, they had laid 161 miles of track in Texas. Now, I've actually never been to Texas, but I don't think 161 miles is going to make up a sizable distance in that state. But they had that company. It was first the Atlantic and Pacific, then it went to Southern Pacific, then back to A&P, mostly because of for scandalous reasons. But that 160 miles was the most that anybody had done on a especially transcontinental effort before the war. Again, is that a whole lot in terms of the whole country? Not really, but it was definitely far more of an effort than any other state or any other company had tried up to that point. Now, sort of tying this in with my last talk in another way, some scholars estimate about 76% of the labor force were slaves. The B&O was a major exception to that. There are about 12,000 to 14,000 slaves employed on Southern railroads in some capacity by 1860. And some would be added during the war as well. I think I saw a number as high as 16 in 1863 or 64. Since the majority of the track was laid after 1850, the number of slaves used by the railroads is going to increase significantly after that time and was considerably higher than 1840 and even 1830. Unlike most industries, and I found this kind of interesting, as much capitalization as you need on a railroad, most railroads did not own their own slaves. They hired them out. There are some exceptions to this, but that was generally the rule. And I think that makes the number of slaves on the railroads even more impressive because there were a lot, since you have to hire them out, there's a lot of plantation owners, there's a lot of slave owners that see value in railroads, right? This is not a system that is necessarily wholly antithetical to their way of life. And that is one of the things tying into the lost cause that a lot of I don't even know how to say it. A lot of the people that weaponize the term lost cause will try to establish the railroads as somehow antithetical to antebellum Southern life, and that was not the case either. In fact, one of the reasons one thing we see with hired slaves is that sometimes they're actually indemnified. If they get hurt, in some way there's some sort of payment, higher payment than their wage to compensate for that. We see all different kinds of contracts, a day, a week, 3 days out of the week, 20 days out of the month, whatever. Some slaves are hired, basically given like yearly contracts in some places. And so there is, again, a lot of decisions going on in this calculus, but there doesn't seem to be any clear relationship between the few states that did own their own. There doesn't seem to be any clear relationship between where they were and their business practices. So there's North Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia all have railroads that own slaves outright. They're not the biggest ones, though. So there doesn't seem to be any necessary correlation between the size of the railroad and that particular aspect of their business practices. There also doesn't seem to be any necessary connection between the job on the railroad and the race of the person doing the job. With a few minor exceptions, slaves were doing about anything. Like I said in the last lecture, I think, unless it required the vote, notable wealth, or a formal education, slaves were doing almost everything on the railroad. And I think I saw masonry was the notable exception to that in construction. Now, afterwards, you see a pretty strict division between what you might call like a public end or front end customer service type of a job, like a conductor and a brakeman or thing like that. But before the war, during construction, I mean, you don't really see those things. One final thing I'll say is that as railroads spread throughout the country after they're constructed, there's a lot of concern about disruption of life and so on and so forth. One of the things I found interesting, first of all, before the war, both sections had integrated and segregated cars, integrated and segregated lines. In the North, though, there seems to be a much greater push to keep that segregation. Somebody yesterday talked about how the low populations of African Americans in the South, or excuse me, in the North, and part of that disruption in the North is that lack of racial integration. There are some segregated cars in the South, but there's also not that great of a push to make segregated what was integrated. There are a lot of Southerners, a lot of Southern newspapers that didn't seem to care if slaves were boarding their railroads or free blacks were boarding their railroads. Oftentimes, slaves actually had more freedom on the railroads than their free black counterparts in the North. So, for example, a slave oftentimes would have to have a badge or some kind of a pass to prove that he had been given permission to work by his master, and thus he was traveling on the road for work. There was no great outcry about integrating those cars in the South. In the North, however, somebody mentioned Frederick Douglass getting tossed off a train. There's also, even within the train itself, within the actual line of cars, sometimes division. So the railroad itself, for example, might say these cars are integrated. But if you know anything about some of the cars, especially sleepers were often owned by individuals, not the railroad. So if an individual didn't want his sleeper integrated, he could say it has to be segregated. And so sometimes blacks would get on what they thought was an integrated train and only to get kicked out of the sleeper because whoever owned the sleeper did not want it to be integrated. So I think these things, sometimes I think maybe a little bit of confusion is good when we think we know certain things. And so I think stories like that, episodes like that, show that what we think would be disrupted is not always what was disrupted. What we think would be accomplished, people coming together, so on and so forth, is not always accomplished. Phil last night talked about governmental official policies of segregation. I think we see from the railroad in the North in particular how that existed on and in the life of an everyday person who might not really even care about what Sherman is doing, what either of the Sherman brothers were doing, or what this or that general was doing, or this or that politician. All they knew is they go from A to B, and in that transit, they do or don't want to be in an integrated car. Or they find that there are more people that don't look like them in a given place. And those sorts of things are recurring pretty frequently. Pretty frequently, and more than you might think, or more than when I say people in general, might think across the North, where, as in the South, before the war, we don't see that. Yeah.